If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. This week and every week on Biblical Anarchy, we seek to live counterculture to the empire of man and to instead seek the kingdom of God by unpacking what the Bible teaches about government, authority, and human relationships. I am your host, Jacob Winograd. For today's episode, I'm just going to give some musings and sort of my thoughts on some of the recent shows and debates and things that I've been a part of. Mainly the debate I did on the Crucible with Andrew Wilson. So for those of you who listen and watch me on YouTube, I guess you'll know of this, but it might, for the audio listeners and those who don't follow me on social media, be news. But so this was back on, I want to say, May 27th or something along those lines. No, May 20th. I don't know. Somewhere along, it was May 20th, actually, I'm pretty sure. I did a debate on the debate channel known as The Crucible, which is run by Andrew Wilson. And Andrew had actually reacted to some of my content a little while back and said he liked some of the things I had to say. And then I did a reaction to his debate of sorts with Lauren Chen, and that led to him inviting me on to have a debate / conversation. And I do recommend you check that out. That's available on my YouTube as well as on the LCI Green Room. It's a pretty contentious debate, 3 hours long, and that's sort of like the style that Andrew does. It's meant to be it's called The Crucible, right? So it's meant to be a high stakes, he calls it blood sport debating, and the guests are sort of grilled relentlessly. It's like a 3 hour, almost like being roasted, but in debate form. And it's just like, you have to sit there and just relentlessly be attacked by all sorts of arguments and try to hold your own against not only your debate partner, but then the onslaught of commenters and super chats and call-ins and all that. I think I did pretty well, all things considered. The good thing about debate is that it helps you to refine your ideas and to maybe bring up things that you just haven't really considered or dived into yet. Andrew kind of gave me a couple oppositions to some of my libertarian arguments that was not really well thought out on. And I sort of just punted on those in a sense to be like, well, these wouldn't be hills I would die on. So like the two he gave were sort of like, well, should you have laws that prevent bestiality or laws that prevent necrophilia? And I was sort of like, well, I don't want the state to exist. And I am somewhat skeptical of the state being a solution to cultural problems and degeneracy. And so like that's where the nuance is for me. It's not so much that I'm a fan of bestiality or necrophilia, but I feel like if you're at the point in a society where that's a really big problem, I don't know that you're in a position to use the state as an effective means to stop it. But just in general, like I was sort of like, well, listen, in theory, like just, I don't know, there's probably in most states laws against such things. And insofar as they exist and are enforced, can a libertarian make an argument that's a violation of the NAP? Like, I suppose, is that a hill that I feel especially led to die on? No. And it sort of gets into, I guess, like the territory of like, what even am I, right? Because there were some people that I know that thought like I was a little bit too theocratic or theocentric and not libertarian enough in that debate. I've talked about this in a previous episode. I'm trying to remember the episode number, but it's the titles of Why I'm Not an Anarchist, which is sort of clickbaity to basically just make the point in a lot more detail, but just to make the point here I'll summarize it just being that I lead with my Christian values, and I'm not a libertarian by like, that's my identity. I don't view libertarianism as like my religion that I operate on. I operate on my Christian principles. I just happen to think that libertarianism is the most consistent expression of Christian political thought, as our founder, Dr. Norman Horn, says here at the Libertarian Christian Institute. But that doesn't mean that there's not slight deviations or just augmentations or a difference in expression or emphasis. I think for a lot of secular libertarians, or maybe the more libertine type of libertarians, for them what matters most is the right of the individual to not be aggressed upon in anything they do that is nonviolent. And to be clear, I wouldn't say that that's not an important emphasis of Christian libertarianism, right? Or even Christianity. Like I think in general, there's a large overlap where Christianity would say that we should, in general, prefer not to use force against those who are not aggressing against other people. And I think that applies in 99.9% of cases easily, if not 100%. But there are gray areas, and some libertarians don't think there are gray areas. And I guess I'm not as dogmatically committed to suggesting that there are no gray areas. I think that the gray areas are rare. But yeah, like if we had someone gets into things like decency and public exposure. So like there might be some libertarians that would say, well, if you're on your property and you're like even just having like sexual intercourse on your front lawn with like your spouse or just with a random person, and everyone can see you, that you're not hurting anyone, you're not aggressing against anyone. So like, who are they to pass a law against you doing that, or against things like public nudity, or I mean, gets into all sorts of stuff like that. So this gets into, I guess, like a difference between, it's not quite description versus prescription, but it's similar to that. And it gets into things that I've talked about even like in the past several months, like when I had Dave Smith on and we were talking about immigration, where I feel like part of the problem is sort of that dichotomy between abolish and privatize. And I suppose the issue is that I think some libertarians just want to abolish things like decency laws, right? Like public nudity laws and things like that. And I guess laws against bestiality and laws against necrophilia might be sort of related to that. So that's probably an area more where I would say privatize, because I do view those things as not desirable. Like, I don't think you should have a society where people are walking around nude, having sex in open spaces, or even if they're on their private property, I don't think they should be having sex where people can obviously see them. Okay, I'm not trying to, if you have a nice estate where it's like fenced in and guarded and no one can see you, then I guess have at it. But like if you're on a public street or in plain sight and you're doing that, like I don't think that's good. I don't think bestiality or necrophilia are good. Now, I don't want the state to exist, but that doesn't mean I don't want those rules to be enforced in society. And so this is where the sort of like Austro-libertarian world has actually come up with answers for how these things can be handled, but not through the state, but through market mechanisms. And so you get into things like covenant communities and contract law that can essentially be used to enact things that would be like, you could clumsily call them privacy laws or laws against bestiality and necrophilia, but they would be less of a criminal offense in terms of like, oh, these violate the NAP, and they'd be more of an enforcement of contract law and of things that people voluntarily agreed to in exchange for being represented by some sort of individual liability insurance company or dispute resolution organization, or by being part of a certain private property community, which is what a covenant community is. And there's a lot of literature on this. I recommend reading the private law literature on the Mises Institute and checking out Hans Hermann Hoppe and his work on covenant communities. Now, this is all like in the land of theory, right? Like private law and all that. Like I think that stuff's fascinating, and I think that it's logical and consistent with itself, consistent with private property rights, and are viable solutions from sort of the worldview that I'm espousing. But I guess where some libertarians might go, well, fine, you could do those things in a free market society, but in the meantime, you can't have the state doing them. And that's where I guess the deviation comes from me from sort of a purist libertarian perspective, where I would say, well, because I view things through that sort of like privatize, abolish lens, there are many things, I won't say many, might be a wrong word, but there are certainly a number of things that I think are important for a well-functioning society that I don't want the state to do, insofar as I don't ideally want the state to exist. But I'm not willing to just abolish state laws in those areas. Rather, what I would advocate for is at least a decentralized approach where the laws are enforced at the locality level and not at the state or federal level, but obviously as local as you can make it. And if you can't, in the meantime, like, you take what you can get. Like, so I don't think we should abolish the murder laws. I don't think we should abolish the theft laws. I don't think we should abolish laws saying that parents can't starve their children or that parents can't beat their children. Like, and this might sound to maybe like the non-libertarians might sound like, well, who would be disagreeing with you? There are some libertarian, especially libertarian anarchist types, that they do think, well, no, you just abolish this stuff and let the market take over. But the problem is, what usually happens is if you try to theorize abolishing this stuff, well, the state's still a monopoly over these areas. And so it's not going to allow these sort of market governing forces to come in and take their place. And so rather what you will achieve is a sort of tyranny imposed by the state, taking away all governance from a certain sphere of society in general. And so it's a sort of double tyranny where the state says, we are the only ones that have the right to enforce X, and we're choosing not to, while excluding anyone else from enforcing it either. Some people call this anarcho-tyranny, which can be a bit of a confusing title, and some people hate it, but it's kind of catchy, so I use it sometimes. But anyway, that would be what I would advocate against, abolishing those laws, and I think that's more of a privatized thing. And it's also sort of like, well, is living in a stateless society even possible? And this is where, like, my mission is less about abolishing the state and more about defending Christian values. So this is where I was telling Andrew in our conversation, we have crossover because he's more of like a Christian nationalist, Christian populist type. But I was like, if you want a Christian nation, if you want Christian populism, if you want Christian values defended in society, then you need to actually take up the work that I'm taking up in advocating for decentralizing the state, repealing as much as possible, rolling it back to the local level, and making the state either, I mean, like, the ideal is not exist, but at least make it so small that it doesn't have the power it currently has and wields against the church, that it wields against the family, that it uses to subvert Christian values. And that's really the heart of why I'm a Christian libertarian. I mean, one, I do find libertarianism to be compelling. I find it to be very true in regards of, like, it's like the most consistent expression of sort of like a sort of natural law and sort of taking natural law to its natural conclusions. But it's important to note that there are some areas of study of like libertarian legal theory that still need some work. Carrie Baldwin, for example, was doing a lot of work on self-ownership as it pertains to children. And this extends to why she's one of the best voices on the pro-life position from the libertarian perspective. And I think that's good. I hope libertarian philosophy continues to develop and work out the kinks in those areas. But in the meantime, it's subordinate to my Christian values. And I view libertarianism as sort of a means of defending Christian values and really complementing Christian values, as there's a lot of overlap there, but not the ends in and of themselves. Because you could imagine a sort of libertarian society that would be quite dystopian, because liberty is important, but liberty should be grounded in virtue. And if you have liberty without virtue, you will still end up in tyranny. It might just be a different type of tyranny. So anyway, that's food for thought. And I highly encourage that you guys check out that debate I did. And also on YouTube, I did a couple of reaction videos, and those will be posted in the Green Room feed as well. Yeah, I'm mostly going to use this audio feed, the Biblical Anarchy podcast feed, for exclusively solo content with maybe the occasional guest. I'm doing a lot of my debates and long form with other people on YouTube and then in the Green Room feed because it just works out better. And then here's where most of the time I'm going to be doing a lot of the solo content I do, where I, for example, the last episode where I dived into sort of the complexity and the debate surrounding national morality. And before that, I talked about sphere sovereignty and kind of diving into the weeds and, exploring Christian theology or libertarian philosophy and sort of finding those connections. And I plan to continue doing that. There are going to be some times where I get so busy on the YouTube end and the Green Room end that I might not always get weekly content out here because the content I put out here, I try to make sure I do a good job at researching it and making sure that it's well thought out, well put together. And so, yeah, I apologize. There's been a couple gaps in production, but I'm working to, as my workloads and sort of content creation evolves, I'm ever vigilant in trying to change my workflow and planning to keep up with it. But yeah, I guess the point I want to drive home here in terms of my thoughts on that debate with Andrew and even some of the conversations I've had with people like CJ Engel and Stephen Wolfe, which, by the way, I will be having another conversation with Stephen Wolfe that'll be out sometime in late June or early July at the latest. But yeah, it's important, I think, to recognize the moment that we're in. And I think that Dave Smith says it best, that libertarians need to learn a conservative lesson and conservatives need to learn a libertarian lesson. And I just kind of go one step further than Dave and say it's a Christian lesson. Conservatives have failed to conserve much. And I think that's because if they try to use the state as the mechanism for their conserving, the state subverts their efforts. And I think that's rather biblical also. The state often is the greatest purveyor of idolatry, the greatest purveyor of working to undo what is good in society. And that's really what, libertarianism doesn't tell you a lot of things. Libertarianism doesn't tell you how to properly raise a child other than just kind of a minimalist, don't hurt them, I guess. But it doesn't tell you what values to instill in them. It doesn't come with sort of the virtues for how to live a good life, what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a good father, what it means to be a good husband, what it means to be a good neighbor. It basically just tells you the minimum of at the very least, to not be a bad person, you at the very least have to not initiate aggression against other people, which is good and true. And I affirm that and I believe in that insofar as I do identify as a libertarian. But it's not enough. And that's why it's the Biblical Anarchy podcast, right? It's libertarianism has a lot of truth, but Christianity is the source of ultimate truth. And I'm a soldier for the kingdom of God at the end of the day. And I want to see the gospel message spread. I want to see people's lives transformed by Christ in the same way mine has. I want to see society changed, sort of on a wide scale. And so this is why I often have been sort of friendly with the Christian nationalists, is not because I don't see the flaws in their ideas, but I understand where a lot of them are coming from. And I think their heart is at least to see virtue return to society, that they want to see a revival in Christianity. And I just, rather than making them my enemy, I want to say, hey, listen, you could describe my views as Christian nationalism in a way, insofar as lowercase n, nations exist, groups of people exist, and I want them to be Christian, right? But how do we get there? And if there's anything we learned through the Old Testament narrative, which I'm going to be diving more into some of that a little bit, but the other thing we learned is that the state, that coercion, that initiating force, that wars of aggression, that laws aimed at controlling behavior, that they fall short of making society virtuous. And so I'm kind of setting up for next week's episode, because next week's episode, I'm going to dive a little bit into covenant theology and how this actually shows us, in part, how the state cannot be used as a means of enforcing virtue. And even though, like I told Andrew in our debate, like laws against certain things, I'm not going to die on the hill of repealing those, and perhaps they should exist, but we can't be putting our faith in these things to keep society moral. Like, if you have to enforce a law to stop people from having sex with animals or from having sex with corpses, if that's a major problem, you have some work to do to fix your culture, to enforce virtue. And at the very least, like, there should be something troubling if it's like, if the only thing keeping people from doing that is that you're using the force of the state, if you're using the point of a gun, which is what law is, if you're using the point of a gun to stop people from doing it, that's bad, right? So we need to learn some of these lessons from the Bible, and covenant theology is a big part of that, because someone pressed me on this in the debate during the Q&A portion, and they were like, well, why shouldn't we stone homosexuals? It's what the Old Testament said. I was like, you don't understand covenant theology. And he's like, well, give me the verse. It's like, well, listen, I get 30 seconds to answer these questions. I can't give you a full answer, but I will give you guys the full answer. And I mean, I've talked about this in passing in the past, but I think it's good to put a full episode out on this and to really, really dive into it. So that's what next week's episode is going to be. So yeah, look forward to that. As always, please consider becoming an LCI insider. You go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com to find out more about that. Help support the show. It means a lot. If you're not subscribed on YouTube, especially, I encourage you to go do that. I'm coming close to the point where I'll be fully monetized. I'm halfway there. Like, you can do super chats and stuff and subscribe to the channel. And once I get up to 1,000 subscribers and enough watch hours, I'll be fully monetized. And that's exciting because the live content, a lot of that reaches a lot of people and wide audiences, including on X. So yeah, make sure you're subscribed and help support the show if you can. Helps me to go out there and to argue for these ideas and fight the good fight. So I appreciate all of you so much. That's all I got for you guys. So I'll talk to you guys next week. Live at peace. Live for Christ.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.